Malik was known long before he was understood. In his neighborhood, his name carried a quiet weight, the kind that came from consistency rather than noise. He was the man people mentioned when they spoke about reliability. The one who arrived early, stayed late, and never made excuses. He greeted elders with respect, spoke politely to strangers, and handled responsibilities without complaint. No one ever worried whether Malik would do what he promised. He always did. Every morning, Malik left his small apartment before the sun grew harsh. The streets were already awake, filled with the soft sounds of buses, footsteps, distant voices, and the rhythm of daily life beginning again. He walked with steady purpose, shoulders squared, face calm, eyes forward. To anyone watching, he looked like a man who knew where he was going, a man with direction and balance. People trusted Malik because he never demanded attention. He did not overshare, boast, or dramatize his life. He listened more than he spoke. When asked questions, he answered simply. When thanked, he nodded and moved on. In a world full of people eager to be seen, Malik was respected for his restraint. What no one noticed was how carefully that restraint was maintained. Malik had learned early that composure was a shield. Growing up, he observed how emotions could complicate situations, how vulnerability often invited judgment rather than support. So he practiced control. He learned to keep his voice level, his expressions neutral, his reactions measured. Over time, this control became second nature, so much so that even he stopped questioning it. At work, Malik was dependable to a fault. He volunteered for extra shifts when others declined. He covered 4 colleagues without complaint. His supervisors praised his dedication, calling him hardworking, mature, and reliable. They spoke about him as if he were unshakable, as if pressure did not affect him the way it affected everyone else. Malik accepted the praise quietly. He never corrected their assumptions. He never said that the weight they placed on him was heavier than they realized. In his family, Malik played a similar role. He was the one relatives called when problems arose. If someone needed advice, Malik listened. If someone needed help, Malik showed up. Birthdays, funerals, celebrations, emergencies, Malik was present for them all. His presence was reassuring, steady, and calm. It made others feel safe. What they did not see was how draining it felt to always be the strong one. Malik rarely spoke about himself. When conversations turned personal, he redirected them gently. If asked how he was doing, he answered with a familiar phrase that required no follow-up. "I'm fine." He said it so often that it lost meaning, becoming a reflex rather than a statement. No one questioned it. Why would they? Malik looked fine. He acted fine. He functioned. The truth was more complicated. Inside, Malik lived a constant, low hum of tension. It was not loud enough to interrupt his daily routine, but it never fully disappeared. It followed him through his days, settled into his chest at night, and greeted him again each morning. It was the feeling of carrying something unfinished, something unspoken, something unresolved. He did not have language for it. He only knew that he felt tired in a way sleep could not fix. Malik's apartment reflected his personality. It was clean, organized, and modest. Nothing was out of place. There were no personal photographs on the walls, no objects that revealed too much about him. It was a space designed for function, not comfort, a place to rest, not to linger. When Malik returned home in the evenings, he moved through the space quietly. He cooked simple meals, ate without distraction, and cleaned up immediately afterward. Sometimes he sat by the window and watched the city lights come on, one by one. Other times, he lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of life outside continue without him. He rarely invited people over, not because he disliked company, but because solitude felt safer. Alone, he did not have to perform. He did not have to reassure anyone. He did not have to answer questions he was not ready to face. Malik was not lonely in the traditional sense. He was surrounded by people. He was included, respected, and welcomed. Yet there was a distance between him and the world that no one seemed to notice. It was subtle, invisible, easy to miss unless you were looking closely, and no one was. People often assumed Malik had his life figured out. They pointed to his stability as evidence. He had a job. He paid his bills. He avoided trouble. In their eyes, these things equaled success. They believed struggle always announced itself loudly, with visible signs and dramatic moments. Malik's struggle did none of those things. It existed, quietly, patiently waiting. Sometimes when Malik stood among others, he felt like a background presence in his own life. Conversations flowed around him while he remained just outside of them, participating without fully engaging. Laughter reached his ears, but it did not always reach his chest. Joy passed through him without staying long. He wondered, occasionally, if this was simply adulthood, if this quiet heaviness was normal, if everyone felt this way and just handled it better than he did. Without comparison, he assumed his experience was unremarkable. So he kept going. Malik believed that as long as he fulfilled his responsibilities, everything else would fall into place. He believed that discipline could compensate for emotional neglect. He believed that time alone would heal what he never addressed. These beliefs were reinforced by the world around him. Every compliment about his strength, every expression of gratitude for his reliability, every assumption that he was fine, pushed him further into silence. They built a narrative about who Malik was, and Malik stepped into it without resistance. It was easier than correcting it. What no one understood was that Malik's strength had a cost. Every time he chose composure over honesty, the distance between his inner world and outer life grew wider. Every time he dismissed his own discomfort, the wound inside him settled deeper, but because the wound did not bleed, because it did not disrupt his productivity or behavior, it remained unseen. Malik did not wake up one day feeling broken. There was no single moment he could point to and say, that is when it started. The wound developed slowly, layered over time through expectation, responsibility, and silence. It shaped him quietly. In moments of stillness, Malik sometimes felt a strange sense of detachment. As though he were observing himself from a distance, he would catch his reflection in glass or mirrors and feel unfamiliar with the person looking back. The man appeared composed, capable, even confident. Malik recognized him, but did not fully feel him. These moments passed quickly. Malik brushed them aside and returned to his routine. There was always something to do, somewhere to be, someone to help. Movement was easier than reflection. Yet beneath the movement, the wound remained. Malik's life was not defined by chaos or crisis. There were no visible signs of collapse. That was precisely why no one saw the damage accumulating inside him. The absence of drama convinced everyone, including Malik himself, that everything was under control. He did not realize that control was not the same as healing. By all outward measures, Malik was a man who had it together. He was trusted, relied upon, and respected. People felt safe around him. They felt supported by him. They felt reassured by his presence. What they never considered was who reassured Malik, who asked him to rest, who asked him to speak, who asked him how he truly was. The answer was no one. And Malik, conditioned by years of expectation and silence, did not ask himself either. This was how the wound survived. Quiet, invisible, untouched. This was the beginning of a story no one thought needed telling. Because from the outside, there was nothing wrong at all. Malik's existence at this stage could be mistaken for peace. But peace requires presence, and Malik was rarely present with himself. His attention stayed outward, fixed on obligations and expectations, leaving little room for inner awareness. This absence did not alarm him because it felt familiar, almost natural. He had lived this way for so long that imagining anything different felt unrealistic. He believed that being needed was the same as being valued. Each request confirmed his usefulness, reinforcing the idea that his role was essential. What he did not see was how this belief limited him, reducing his identity to function rather than experience. He existed to serve, to support, to stabilize, not to feel. There were no dramatic signs warning him of emotional injury. No breakdowns. No public struggles. Just a slow dulling of sensation, a quiet retreat from himself. The wound thrived in this environment, protected by normalcy. If someone had asked Malik to describe his inner world, he would have struggled. The language was missing. He had spent years refining how to meet external demands, but none learning how to attend to his internal state. His emotions existed, but unorganized, unacknowledged, and unnamed. This invisibility extended to his pain. Without recognition, it remained abstract, undefined, and therefore easy to ignore. Malik did not realize that unaddressed pain does not disappear. It waits. For now, silence holds. The days continue, unchallenged and uninterrupted, giving no hint that anything beneath the surface requires attention. Malik moves forward because that is what he knows, because stopping feels unfamiliar. The wound remains quiet, patient, and unseen, waiting for a moment when endurance will no longer be enough to carry him through. That moment has not arrived yet. But its absence does not mean it will never come. For now, Malik continues, unchanged, unaware, and deeply human in his unrecognized pain. His story pauses here, steady and unresolved, as life carries on around him, confident in appearances, blind to the truth beneath. This is how invisible wounds survive inside ordinary, trusted lives, quietly. Malik did not remember the exact day strength stopped being a choice and became a requirement. But he remembered the feeling clearly. It was the feeling of being looked at differently, of being expected to hold things together simply because he appeared capable. It settled over him quietly, without ceremony, and stayed. From that moment on, the world did not ask whether he could carry the weight. It assumed he would. His father's death marked the beginning of this shift. It was sudden, unexpected, and final. One day his father existed, present in small routines and familiar sounds, and the next day he was gone. The house felt different immediately. Quieter, heavier, unsettled. Grief entered the space, but so did urgency. There were arrangements to make, people to notify, decisions to take. Life did not pause to allow emotions to unfold naturally. Malik was not the oldest in the family, but he was the one who seemed the most composed. When others cried, he remained still. When confusion spread, he focused on tasks. This composure was mistaken for readiness. Without discussion, responsibilities shifted toward him. It happened subtly, almost gently, but the result was unmistakable. Malik became the anchor. Relatives praised him for his maturity. Friends admired his calm. Elders nodded approvingly at the way he handled matters. Each gesture reinforced the same message: this is who you are now. The strong one. The reliable one. The one who does not fall apart. Malik accepted the role because there was no alternative presented. No one asked if he was ready. No one suggested that strength could coexist with vulnerability. The expectation was clear, and Malik stepped into it, believing that this was what was required of him. Grief for Malik did not have the space to breathe. There was no time to sit with it, no encouragement to express it. Each day brought another responsibility, another demand on his attention. By the time night came, exhaustion replaced emotion. He slept because his body required it, not because his mind found rest. He told himself that he would deal with his feelings later, when things settled down. Later never arrived. Over time, Malik learned that expressing pain made people uncomfortable. When he showed signs of sadness, conversations shifted quickly. People reminded him to stay strong, to be thankful, to move forward. These reminders were not unkind, but they were dismissive. They taught Malik that his pain was something to manage privately, something that should not disrupt others. So he stopped showing it. Strength, Malik discovered, was rewarded. Silence was praised. Endurance was admired. The more he held in, the more capable he appeared. This created a dangerous equation. The less he expressed, the more he was trusted. The more he was trusted, the more was expected of him. This pattern repeated itself beyond his family. In school, in work environments, in social settings, Malik was seen as dependable. When pressure arose, it was directed toward him. When decisions needed to be made, he was consulted. When stability was required, he was the answer. No one noticed that this stability came at a cost. Malik rarely declined requests. Saying no felt like failure. It felt like letting people down. He had internalized the belief that his value lay in his usefulness. As long as he was needed, he mattered. This belief kept him moving even when he was exhausted. He began to equate rest with weakness. Taking time for himself felt irresponsible, almost selfish. There was always someone else who needed something, always another obligation waiting. Malik pushed through fatigue, convinced that endurance was a virtue. His emotional world narrowed as his responsibilities expanded. There was less room for reflection, less tolerance for uncertainty. He became efficient, focused, and distant. These traits served him well externally, but internally, they created separation. He moved through life like someone managing a system rather than experiencing it. Moments that should have invited emotion instead triggered control. Sadness became something to suppress. Anger became something to redirect into productivity. Fear became something to ignore. Malik did not label these emotions. He simply adjusted his behavior to avoid their disruption. Over time, this adjustment became automatic. Malik's relationships reflected this shift. People confided in him, trusted him with their vulnerabilities. He listened carefully, offered thoughtful responses, and remained steady. He was admired for his emotional intelligence, for his ability to stay calm when others could not. What no one saw was that Malik never offered the same openness in return. He did not share his fears, his doubts, or his unresolved grief. Not because he believed others would reject him, but because he no longer recognized these feelings as something that could be shared. They existed in a private space, disconnected from language. Strength, for Malik, had become synonymous with silence. As years passed, Malik's sense of self became increasingly tied to his role. He identified himself through what he provided rather than what he felt. This identification felt safe. It gave him structure. It allowed him to navigate the world without confronting the uncertainty inside him, but it also limited him. When challenges arose that could not be solved through action alone, Malik struggled. Emotional conflicts left him unsettled. Situations requiring vulnerability made him uncomfortable. He responded by withdrawing slightly, maintaining control through distance. People interpreted this distance as calm. They assumed Malik was unaffected, unbothered. Their assumptions reinforced his behavior, convincing him that his approach was correct. Inside, however, something remained unresolved. Malik carried his father's absence quietly. He thought about him often, but not in ways that allowed release. Memories surfaced unexpectedly, triggered by small details. A sound, a phrase, a familiar routine. Each memory brought a brief tightening in his chest, followed by dismissal. There was no space to dwell. There never was. He believed that acknowledging grief would weaken him. This belief was not explicitly taught, but it was absorbed through observation and repetition. He had seen how others were treated when they expressed pain. He had learned which emotions were acceptable and which were inconvenient. So he adjusted accordingly. Malik's strength became a performance he could not step away from. Even when alone, he maintained it. He did not cry openly. He did not express frustration loudly. He processed emotions intellectually rather than emotionally, analyzing rather than feeling. This approach gave him control, but it also created numbness. Feelings dulled over time, becoming less accessible. Joy became muted. Excitement faded quickly. Satisfaction felt temporary. The wound inside him deepened, not through trauma alone, but through neglect. Strength, Malik realized subconsciously, was isolating. The more capable he appeared, the less support he received. People assumed he did not need it. They leaned on him without considering the weight he carried. He did not resent them. He understood their perspective. He had helped create it. Malik believed that if he could just maintain control, everything would remain manageable. He convinced himself that emotions were distractions, obstacles to efficiency. This belief allowed him to function, but it also prevented healing. Healing requires acknowledgement. Malik avoided acknowledgement. There were moments, brief and rare, when Malik questioned his path. When exhaustion settled deeper than usual. When he felt disconnected even from his own thoughts. These moments passed quickly, buried under routine and responsibility. He told himself that everyone carried burdens. That life was inherently difficult. That his experience was not unique. These rationalizations comforted him, allowing him to avoid deeper inquiry. Strength. in this sense, became a defense mechanism. It protected him from vulnerability, but it also prevented growth. Malik's world rewarded his approach. He advanced professionally. He gained respect socially. He maintained stability financially. These achievements validated his methods. They provided evidence that his silence was working. What they did not address was the emotional cost. As Malik aged, the role solidified. It became harder to imagine himself differently. Strength was no longer something he practiced. It was something he embodied. Letting go of it felt like losing his identity. He did not realize that identities built on suppression eventually fracture. The wound inside Malik remained unseen because it was buried beneath functionality. He did everything expected of him, and more. From the outside, there was no reason to suspect imbalance. But inside, the wound waited. It did not demand attention. It did not disrupt his routine. It simply existed, influencing his perceptions, shaping his responses, and limiting his capacity for connection. Malik did not know how to stop being strong. He did not know what existed beyond endurance. No one had shown him another way. So he continued. Strength became his default response to pain, his shield against uncertainty, his proof of worth. He carried it with pride, unaware of how much it was costing him. Malik moves forward, believing that strength will continue to carry him through. He does not yet see that what once helped him survive is slowly preventing him from healing. The world remains confident in his stability. Malik remains committed to his role. The wound, still unseen, continues to shape his life from within. Malik's life had become a careful balance between what was expected of him and what he could endure. The years of responsibility, expectation, and quiet observation had solidified into a routine so precise that it seemed unbreakable. Yet within this routine, a subtle shift had occurred. Silence, which once had been a tool, now dominated his existence. It grew quietly, imperceptibly, embedding itself in every thought, every habit, every interaction. It became the air he breathed, invisible but vital, sustaining him while simultaneously keeping him isolated. From the outside, Malik remained the same reliable figure. He arrived on time, handled tasks meticulously, and engaged with people politely. His family depended on him, his friends trusted him, and colleagues relied on him. Every nod of approval, every word of thanks, every acknowledgement of his competence reinforced the perception that Malik was perfectly balanced and emotionally composed. No one questioned it. And why would they? He looked fine. He acted fine. Functioned fine. Yet inside, the silence was louder than anyone could hear. It began as a protective mechanism, a way to maintain composure, to shield himself from scrutiny, and to avoid disrupting others with his own vulnerabilities. It was necessary, adaptive, and effective. Over time, however, it shifted from being a choice to being a default state. Silence was no longer just protection, it became a barrier, separating him from himself and from those around him. It grew without notice, feeding on unexpressed emotions, deferred grief, and unrealized needs. Malik often thought about his father in these quiet moments. His father's death had been sudden, and Malik had taken on the responsibility of caring for his family immediately. In that period, there was no time to process grief, no room for tears, no acknowledgement that he too was mourning. He had been praised for stepping up, for being strong, for keeping the household together. Each compliment had reinforced the notion that expression of personal pain was unnecessary, even undesirable. Over time, he internalized this lesson. To be valuable, one must endure quietly. This lesson became his blueprint for life. When challenges arose, whether professional setbacks, family disputes, or personal doubts, Malik responded with measured action rather than emotional expression. He analyzed problems, created solutions, and executed plans with precision. Feelings were cataloged, managed, and shelved. There was no space for indulgence, no tolerance for delay caused by vulnerability. Efficiency became his language, control his currency, silence his shield. The silence did not only exist in action, it permeated his internal landscape. Malik rarely spoke to himself about what he was feeling, what he wanted, or what he feared. His mind became a repository for unspoken thoughts, a place where emotions were stored, categorized, and often ignored. This internal cataloging offered an illusion of order, but it did not offer relief. Feelings accumulated, pressing against the walls of his consciousness, subtle yet insistent. They influenced his behavior, his choices, and his capacity for connection, even as he remained unaware of their true weight. In social interactions, this silence manifested in subtle ways. Malik could participate in conversations, laugh when appropriate, offer advice and insight, yet remain emotionally distant. People trusted him with their secrets and vulnerabilities, yet he rarely reciprocated. His distance was often interpreted as composure or wisdom, masking the fact that it was, at least in part, avoidance. Malik did not deliberately withdraw. It had simply become his default. He had not realized that silence, when overused, created isolation. At work, this silence allowed Malik to excel. He was seen as dependable, rational, and unflappable. Colleagues gravitated toward him for guidance. Management praised him for his reliability, and clients trusted his judgment. Yet this same silence prevented Malik from seeking support when needed. He carried burdens alone, internalized pressures that others could have shared, and avoided opportunities to express doubt or fear. The efficiency and reliability that made him admired also contributed to his solitude. Within the family, the pattern persisted. Malik's siblings, parents, extended relatives relied on him without questioning whether he too required care or attention. He maintained schedules, handled disputes, and provided advice without complaint. Praise was abundant, but acknowledgement of his internal state was rare. Love and respect were extended in recognition of his functionality, not his emotional presence. Over time, Malik equated worth with utility. To be valued, he had to endure. To endure, he had to remain silent. The accumulation of silence did not occur abruptly. It was a gradual process, almost imperceptible, reinforced by each instance in which Malik withheld expression and received approval or relief in return. Each unspoken fear, each deferred sadness, each internalized frustration contributed to a reservoir of unresolved emotion. The more he adapted to this dynamic, the more normalized it became, and the less likely he was to confront it. Yet silence has consequences. While it allowed Malik to maintain composure externally, internally it generated tension, fatigue, and an undercurrent of anxiety. Moments of reflection became uncomfortable because they revealed the gap between outward appearance and inner reality. The gap was subtle, sometimes unnoticed even by Malik, but it was ever present. It shaped his perspective, influenced his decisions, and created a quiet sense of disconnection from his own life. He began noticing small signs that the silence was no longer entirely benign. Sleep was restless. Joy felt fleeting. Even simple pleasures, a walk through the neighborhood, a conversation with a friend, a meal shared felt distant. Emotions that had once been vivid were muted, filtered through the lens of habit and self-restraint. Awareness of this muted existence was unsettling, yet Malik lacked the tools to address it. Speaking of feelings had never been modeled as productive. Introspection had never been encouraged. Malik's relationships with others reflected the influence of this silence. He could be present, attentive, and responsive, but rarely vulnerable. He offered support without reciprocation, advice without disclosure, and action without acknowledgement of emotional reality. Friends and colleagues often assumed that he was untroubled, even joyful, because his external behavior provided no evidence to the contrary. They interpreted silence as composure, detachment as confidence. Malik's internal state remained invisible, even to those closest to him. As the silence grew, it began to affect Malik's self-perception. He no longer differentiated between genuine control and habitual suppression. He believed that enduring without complaint was a mark of maturity, and that his emotional needs were secondary, irrelevant, or burdensome. He internalized the idea that being strong meant being unfeeling, that vulnerability equated to weakness. These beliefs shaped his identity, influencing how he interacted with the world and how he understood his own value. Yet the silence carried subtle indicators that something was wrong. Occasional moments of introspection left him restless and uneasy. Brief pangs of regret or sadness emerged without clear triggers. Connections that should have been satisfying felt shallow. Joy was transient. Comfort was fleeting. These signs were faint, often rationalized or ignored, but they were persistent. Malik continued to adhere to routine, believing that functionality was sufficient. He maintained schedules, fulfilled obligations, and met expectations. The external world saw a man in control, reliable, and composed. Internally, however, the wound persisted, fed by unacknowledged feelings and the ongoing accumulation of silence. The very strategies that sustained his life control, endurance, and suppression also prevented the healing he unconsciously desired. In solitude, Malik occasionally recognized the contrast between his outward life and inner state. He would catch a reflection in a window, see his face in a photograph, or listen to the tone of his own voice and feel a disconnect. The person he observed did not fully resemble the man he experienced internally. Yet these moments were fleeting. They were rarely explored in depth, as doing so required an acknowledgement of feelings he had long avoided. Silence, by its nature, can appear benign or even beneficial. Malik had experienced its utility firsthand. It allowed him to navigate responsibilities, maintain social relationships, and achieve recognition. It provided a mechanism for order in a world often chaotic and demanding. But over time, the absence of dialogue, both internal and external, transformed silence from a tool into a barrier. It prevented awareness, expression, and ultimately healing. Malik's silence also influenced his perception of relationships. While he could empathize with others, provide guidance, and offer support, he struggled to convey personal experience. Authentic connection requires reciprocity, vulnerability, and the acknowledgement of shared humanity. By withholding his internal reality, Malik inadvertently limited the depth of intimacy he could experience. People admired him, relied on him, and trusted him, but they did not truly know him. By the end of this period, Malik's existence was characterized by duality. Externally, he was a model of stability, capability, and calm. Internally, he carried a wound amplified by neglect, unexpressed emotions, and the continuous reinforcement of silence. This duality created tension, subtle and persistent. Malik remains committed to his role. The wound, still unseen, continues to shape his life from within. Malik's life had become a careful balance between what was expected of him and what he could endure. The years of responsibility, expectation, and quiet observation had solidified into a routine so precise that it seemed unbreakable. Yet within this routine, a subtle shift had occurred. Silence, which once had been a tool, now dominated his existence. It grew quietly, imperceptibly, embedding itself in every thought, every habit, every interaction. It became the air he breathed, invisible but vital, sustaining him while simultaneously keeping him isolated. From the outside, Malik remained the same reliable figure. He arrived on time, handled tasks meticulously, and engaged with people politely. His family depended on him, his friends trusted him, and colleagues relied on him. Every nod of approval, every word of thanks, every acknowledgement of his competence reinforced the perception that Malik was perfectly balanced and emotionally composed. No one questioned it, and why would they? He looked fine. He acted fine, functioned fine. Yet inside, the silence was louder than anyone could hear. It began as a protective mechanism, a way to maintain composure, to shield himself from scrutiny, and to avoid disrupting others with his own vulnerabilities. It was necessary, adaptive, and effective. Over time, however, it shifted from being a choice to being a default state. Silence was no longer just protection, it became a barrier, separating him from himself and from those around him. It grew without notice, feeding on unexpressed emotions, deferred grief, and unrealized needs. Malik often thought about his father in these quiet moments. His father's death had been sudden, and Malik had taken on the responsibility of caring for his family immediately. In that period, there was no time to process grief, no room for tears, no acknowledgement that he too was mourning. He had been praised for stepping up, for being strong, for keeping the household together. Each compliment had reinforced the notion that expression of personal pain was unnecessary, even undesirable. Over time, he internalized this lesson. To be valuable, one must endure quietly. This lesson became his blueprint for life. When challenges arose, whether professional setbacks, family disputes, or personal doubts, Malik responded with measured action rather than emotional expression. He analyzed problems, created solutions, and executed plans with precision. Feelings were cataloged, managed, and shelved. There was no space for indulgence, no tolerance for delay caused by vulnerability. Efficiency became his language, control his currency, silence his shield. The silence did not only exist in action, it permeated his internal landscape. Malik rarely spoke to himself about what he was feeling, what he wanted, or what he feared. His mind became a repository for unspoken thoughts, a place where emotions were stored, categorized, and often ignored. This internal cataloging offered an illusion of order, but it did not offer relief. Feelings accumulated, pressing against the walls of his consciousness, subtle, yet insistent. They influenced his behavior, his choices, and his capacity for connection, even as he remained unaware of their true weight. In social interactions, this silence manifested in subtle ways. Malik could participate in conversations, laugh when appropriate, offer advice and insight, yet remain emotionally distant. People trusted him with their secrets and vulnerabilities, yet he rarely reciprocated. His distance was often interpreted as composure or wisdom, masking the fact that it was at least in part avoidance. Malik did not deliberately withdraw. It had simply become his default. He had not realized that silence, when overused, created isolation. At work, this silence allowed Malik to excel. He was seen as dependable, rational, and unflappable. Colleagues gravitated toward him for guidance. Management praised him for his reliability, and clients trusted his judgment. Yet this same silence prevented Malik from seeking support when needed. He carried burdens alone, internalized pressures that others could have shared, and avoided opportunities to express doubt or fear. The efficiency and reliability that made him admired also contributed to his solitude. Within the family, the pattern persisted. Malik's siblings, parents, and extended relatives relied on him without questioning whether he, too, required care or attention. He maintained schedules, handled disputes, and provided advice without complaint. Praise was abundant, but acknowledgement of his internal state was rare. Love and respect were extended in recognition of his functionality, not his emotional presence. Over time, Malik equated worth with utility. To be valued, he had to endure. To endure, he had to remain silent. The accumulation of silence did not occur abruptly. It was a gradual process, almost imperceptible, reinforced by each instance in which Malik withheld expression and received approval or relief in return. Each unspoken fear, each deferred sadness, each internalized frustration contributed to a reservoir of unresolved emotion. The more he adapted to this dynamic, the more normalized it became, and the less likely he was to confront it. Yet silence has consequences. While it allowed Malik to maintain composure externally, internally, it generated tension, fatigue, and an undercurrent of anxiety. Moments of reflection became uncomfortable because they revealed the gap between outward appearance and inner reality. The gap was subtle, sometimes unnoticed even by Malik, but it was ever present. It shaped his perspective, influenced his decisions, and created a quiet sense of disconnection from his own life. He began noticing small signs that the silence was no longer entirely benign. Sleep was restless. Joy felt fleeting. Even simple pleasures, a walk through the neighborhood, a conversation with a friend, a meal shared, felt distant. Emotions that had once been vivid were muted, filtered through the lens of habit and self-restraint. Awareness of this muted existence was unsettling, yet Malik lacked the tools to address it. Speaking of feelings had never been modeled as productive. Introspection had never been encouraged. Malik's relationships with others reflected the influence of this silence. He could be present, attentive, and responsive, but rarely vulnerable. He offered support without reciprocation, advice without disclosure, and action without acknowledgement of emotional reality. Friends and colleagues often assumed that he was untroubled, even joyful, because his external behavior provided no evidence to the contrary. They interpreted silence as composure, detachment as confidence. Malik's internal state remained invisible, even to those closest to him. As the silence grew, it began to affect Malik's self-perception. He no longer differentiated between genuine control and habitual suppression. He believed that enduring without complaint was a mark of maturity, and that his emotional needs were secondary, irrelevant, or burdensome. He internalized the idea that being strong meant being unfeeling, that vulnerability equated to weakness. These beliefs shaped his identity, influencing how he interacted with the world and how he understood his own value. Yet the silence carried subtle indicators that something was wrong. Occasional moments of introspection left him restless and uneasy. Brief pangs of regret or sadness emerged without clear triggers. Connections that should have been satisfying felt shallow. Joy was transient. Comfort was fleeting. These signs were faint, often rationalized or ignored, but they were persistent. Malik continued to adhere to routine, believing that functionality was sufficient. He maintained schedules, fulfilled obligations, and met expectations. The external world saw a man in control, reliable and composed. Internally, however, the wound persisted, fed by unacknowledged feelings and the ongoing accumulation of silence. The very strategies that sustained his life control, endurance, and suppression also prevented the healing he unconsciously desired. In solitude, Malik occasionally recognized the contrast between his outward life and inner state. He would catch a reflection in a window, see his face in a photograph, or listen to the tone of his own voice and feel a disconnect. The person he observed did not fully resemble the man he experienced internally. Yet these moments were fleeting. They were rarely explored in depth, as doing so required an acknowledgement of feelings he had long avoided. Silence, by its nature, can appear benign or even beneficial. Malik had experienced its utility firsthand. It allowed him to navigate responsibilities, maintain social relationships, and achieve recognition. It provided a mechanism for order in a world often chaotic and demanding. But over time, the absence of dialogue, both internal and external, transformed silence from a tool into a barrier. It prevented awareness, expression, and ultimately healing. Malik's silence also influenced his perception of relationships. While he could empathize with others, provide guidance, and offer support, he struggled to convey personal experience. Authentic connection requires reciprocity, vulnerability, and the acknowledgement of shared humanity. By withholding his internal reality, Malik inadvertently limited the depth of intimacy he could experience. People admired him, relied on him, and trusted him, but they did not truly know him. By the end of this period, Malik's existence was characterized by duality. Externally, he was a model of stability, capability, and calm. Internally, he carried a wound amplified by neglect, unexpressed emotions, and the continuous reinforcement of silence. This duality created tension, subtle and persistent, influencing decisions, shaping identity, and framing experiences. It was invisible to all observers, yet tangible to Malik in moments of solitude. It grows in quiet, reinforced by years of expectation, habit, and societal interpretation of strength. Malik functions effectively, fulfills obligations, and maintains appearances. Yet internally, is increasingly aware, though not fully conscious, of a dissonance between his outer life and inner reality. The silence, once protective, has become a defining feature, shaping how he experiences the world and himself. Malik moved through the days with a precision that seemed effortless, a rhythm so steady that few noticed the tension beneath it. From morning until night, he fulfilled his roles with quiet diligence. To the casual observer, he appeared present, engaged, and emotionally grounded. Yet the reality of his internal experience told a different story. Malik existed in a state of detachment, subtle but persistent absence that separated him from the very life he maintained so meticulously. This absence did not announce itself. It was not a collapse or a dramatic withdrawal. It was a soft, almost imperceptible disengagement from experiences that others took for granted. Conversations passed over him without fully registering. Laughter echoed, but the sound never reached the core of his being. The world was vibrant, alive, and moving. Yet Malik felt as though he were watching it through a glass pane, distant and disconnected. It was not that he did not care. Malik cared deeply, profoundly even. But the care was compartmentalized, filtered through years of learned restraint. Feeling too strongly had consequences he had experienced in his youth, when emotion met expectation. To survive, to be recognized as reliable and capable, he had to moderate the intensity of his experience. Over time, this moderation became so habitual that he rarely noticed its presence. It was simply who he was. At work, Malik's performance reflected this equilibrium. He engaged fully in projects, offering thoughtful insights and creative solutions. Colleagues sought his opinion on complex matters, assuming that his composure indicated clarity and understanding. Yet the engagement was procedural rather than emotional. He participated, observed, and responded with efficiency. Beneath the surface, however, his mind often wandered, reflecting not on the project at hand, but on subtle feelings of emptiness that he did not articulate. Feelings that had grown as unacknowledged companions over the years. In social spaces, the same pattern persisted. Malik could laugh when prompted, smile when appropriate, and appear present to friends and family. He could offer guidance, celebrate achievements, and provide comfort. Yet there remained a subtle withdrawal, a distance that he could not bridge. It was as though a part of him were perpetually observing life rather than participating in it. The world moved, but he remained partially absent, a silent witness to experiences he could not fully inhabit. This detachment extended into family life. Malik cared for his relatives, guided his siblings, and maintained the household responsibilities expected of him. He did not complain. He executed tasks with efficiency and precision. Yet even in the warmth of familial interaction, he sensed a disconnection. Conversations, meals, gatherings, all these events unfolded around him with energy he could not fully feel. Joy was fleeting, happiness transient, and laughter often hollow, not because he rejected them, but because the capacity to internalize them had diminished over time. Malik noticed the subtle signs of his absence in moments of reflection. Occasionally, he would find himself staring at a familiar objective photograph, a piece of clothing, a small memento and feel, a sense of estrangement. The object was familiar, yet the feelings it evoked were muted. Memories that should have resonated with warmth, sadness, or nostalgia were flattened, filtered through years of restraint. He felt present physically, but his emotional engagement was incomplete. A shadow of what it might have been in a less disciplined existence. These moments of detachment were compounded by exhaustion. The act of constantly moderating his responses, maintaining composure, and prioritizing others' needs created a subtle but persistent fatigue. Sleep did not bring relief. Dreams were sparse, fragmented, and emotionally shallow. Rest was functional rather than restorative. Waking brought a renewal of tasks and responsibilities, yet the underlying absence persisted. Malik operated efficiently, but his inner life remained partially uninhabited. Malik's relationships reflected this duality. Friends admired his reliability, colleagues respected his clarity, and family depended on his support. Yet no one could penetrate the quiet distance that separated him from his own emotional reality. Attempts at intimacy were met with careful restraint. Vulnerability was guarded. Malik had learned, over years of experience, that sharing too much could lead to discomfort, misunderstanding, or expectations of immediacy that he was unwilling or unable to meet. The result was a life outwardly full, but internally compartmentalized. He observed the ease with which others seemed to inhabit their experiences fully, moving through emotions with a naturalness he could not replicate. Children played freely, friends laughed without inhibition, couples expressed affection spontaneously. Malik noted these behaviors with a mixture of admiration and envy. He longed for that fluidity, that unguarded presence, yet feared that pursuing it might destabilize the carefully constructed control he had relied upon for so long. In public spaces, this absence manifested subtly. Malik could sit in a bustling market, observe neighbors, exchange greetings, participate in commerce, without ever feeling fully embedded in the flow of life around him. He moved among people, yet a quiet barrier separated him from the communal energy. He listened to the sounds, observed interactions, performed social rituals competently, but his emotional investment remained partial. The world proceeded with vividness. Malik observed with muted resonance. Even in moments of potential inspiration, music, poetry, art, Malik experienced a muted response. The beauty of rhythm, the resonance of words, the emotional power of melody reached him in small increments, enough to register appreciation but insufficient to generate immersion. Where others were carried by the intensity of experience, Malik remained anchored by restraint, partially present but always holding back. This absence was reinforced by habits of suppression. Over the years, Malik had learned to redirect emotions, rationalize responses, and compartmentalize feelings to maintain functional stability. Each suppressed thought, each controlled reaction, its carefully managed interaction contributed to a subtle yet pervasive distance from his own life. He had internalized the notion that feelings could be deferred, postponed, or ignored without consequence. Yet the reality of sustained emotional absence was more complex, accumulating gradually into a persistent undercurrent of disconnection. Malik recognized, sometimes fleetingly, the impact of this absence on his sense of self. Who he presented to the world efficient, capable, composed was only partially aligned with who he felt internally. He experienced himself as fragmented, present in duty but absent in essence. This realization was uncomfortable but difficult to articulate, as the language to describe internal detachment had not been cultivated. Over time, he adapted, normalizing the dissonance and continuing to operate in a state of partial presence. The wound Malik carried remained unseen, unacknowledged, yet active. It shaped decisions, influenced priorities, and mediated interactions. The absence he felt was not simply a lack of emotional expression. It was a structural component of his existence, embedded in habits, reinforced by social feedback, and validated by external achievement. Functionality masked internal fragmentation, creating a narrative of normalcy that obscured the deeper reality. In solitude, the partial absence became most apparent. Malik would engage in reflective thought, but even reflection was filtered through habitual restraint. He analyzed, categorized, and assessed without fully connecting to the emotional content of experiences. Memories surfaced, yet were met with moderation, not immersion. Regret appeared, but quickly rationalized. Sadness emerged, but contained. Pleasure was fleeting, quickly tempered by awareness of obligation. The mind operated efficiently, but the emotional field remained constrained. The accumulation of these experiences did not result in immediate crisis. Malik functioned successfully, maintained relationships, and met expectations. Outwardly, he appeared balanced and capable. Yet the subtle tension of partial absence persisted, shaping perception and experience. It was an invisible, unquantifiable influence, difficult to measure, but unmistakable in its effects on lived reality. Malik's internal absence was further reinforced by social assumptions. Observers interpreted composure as contentment, reliability as resilience, and silence as equanimity. No one questioned whether Malik was fully present in his life because the cues they relied upon behavior, performance, interaction indicated normalcy. This social reinforcement perpetuated the pattern of partial engagement, making recognition of the absence both unlikely and unnecessary in external terms. Even as Malik began to perceive the gap between appearance and internal reality, he lacked strategies to bridge it. Traditional support structures, conversation, therapy, mentorship, were culturally and personally underutilized. Expressing vulnerability had historically resulted in discomfort or misinterpretation. Consequently, the absence was maintained not only by habit, but by structural and cultural factors that limited the availability of safe avenues for exploration. Malik's life, full of action and interaction, is shadowed by the quiet detachment that defines his lived experience. The narrative highlights the invisible consequences of habitual suppression, illustrating how a life outwardly successful can conceal internal fragmentation. As the story progresses, this partial absence will confront him, challenging assumptions about strength, presence, and selfhood, and setting the stage for a reckoning that cannot be deferred indefinitely. It was an ordinary afternoon in the bustling streets of Lagos, sunlight striking the pavement with clarity that left no shadow unilluminated. The world moved around Malik with the rhythm of life uninterrupted, the calls of market vendors, the rattle of buses, the laughter of children chasing one another along dusty alleys, the hum of conversations layered upon one another like a living symphony. To anyone else, the day was vibrant, energetic, and ordinary. But for Malik, the brilliance of daylight illuminated something far less visible, the weight he had carried silently for years. He walked among the throngs of people, nodding to familiar faces, exchanging polite greetings, offering advice where needed, and performing his usual roles with the efficiency and calm he had cultivated over decades. Outwardly, Malik was unremarkable in his reliability, a fixture in his community admired for steadiness. No one paused to consider what it cost him to maintain this facade of composure. He himself had never stopped to fully consider it until that afternoon. The sun was bright, and the warmth of the light was almost disorienting in its honesty. It revealed textures, colors, and shadows with a precision that made ordinary objects seem vivid. He noticed the sparkle of dust particles suspended in sunlight, the faint shimmer of reflections on puddles from a recent rain, the intricate patterns of cracked paint on shop walls. Life pulsed with clarity all around him. The world was full of energy, movement, and connection. And yet Malik felt a profound absence within himself. It was not a sudden epiphany. Rather, it was a cumulative recognition, a layering of awareness that pressed upon him more insistently than ever before. All at once, he sensed the distance between his own internal life and the external vibrancy surrounding him. Every sound, every smile, every gesture seemed both familiar and alien. Life was happening fully around him, yet he was only partially participating. Malik's attention turned inward, almost involuntarily. He felt the accumulation of years of suppression, restraint, and silence settle over him like a heavy cloak. Responsibilities had always taken precedence: family obligations, professional expectations, community duties. Each had been executed with diligence and care, yet each had also demanded that he suppress his own needs, desires, and emotional responses. Over time, this suppression had become habitual, so natural that he scarcely noticed it until this bright afternoon, when the contrast between outer brilliance and inner void became impossible to ignore. He observed people laughing together, unrestrained and full of life, and felt the gulf separating him from such ease. Children's laughter reached him, but did not resonate fully, as though filtered through a pane of glass. Neighbors exchanged greetings with warmth that he noticed intellectually but could not inhabit emotionally. Conversations swirled around him, carrying snippets of shared history, humor, and concern. And Malik followed along carefully, contributing when necessary, yet remaining detached. The detachment was subtle enough to escape detection by anyone who did not know him intimately. People assumed he was present, engaged, and emotionally aligned. He nodded at jokes, smiled at anecdotes, offered practical advice where requested. He fulfilled every social expectation to perfection. Yet inwardly he felt a hollow echo life unfolding around him, full of richness and color, while he remained partially absent, distant, and unacknowledged. Malik's internal recognition of this absence was accompanied by a strange mixture of fear and clarity. For the first time, he considered the possibility that his entire adult life had been defined by the suppression of self rather than by deliberate choice. Every act of endurance, every instance of restraint, every decision to prioritize others over himself now appeared in a new light, not simply as acts of strength, but also as mechanisms that had gradually isolated him from his own emotional experience. He recalled the years following his father's death. the responsibilities that had been thrust upon him, the praise for his composure, the expectations that had solidified almost imperceptibly. Each compliment and recognition, he realized, had reinforced a pattern in which outward functionality was valued far above inner truth. Over time, this pattern had become self-reinforcing, shaping his identity in ways he had scarcely examined. He had become the man who endures, the man who does not falter, the man who is seen but never truly known. As he walked, Malik noticed the simplest details with unusual clarity. A vendor arranging her wares, the patterned cloth of a passerby, the intricate graffiti on a nearby wall. These ordinary elements of daily life seemed imbued with meaning, yet Malik experienced them from the outside as a spectator rather than a participant. He was present in body, attentive in mind, yet emotionally absent a distinction that had been invisible for so long that its sudden prominence was almost disorienting. The bright daylight seemed almost accusatory, illuminating the discrepancy between appearance and reality. The more Malik observed the world's vibrancy, the more acutely he felt the muted quality of his own engagement. He realized that he had spent decades prioritizing stability, reliability, and composure above emotional presence, and that this prioritization had created a subtle but pervasive absence. This awareness was accompanied by an unexpected emotional surge, a mixture of sadness, longing, and recognition. He felt the weight of years in which emotions had been deferred, deferred again, and then deferred once more. He recognized the cost of habitual suppression, the subtle erosion of connection with his own desires, fears, and joys. The clarity of daylight revealed not just the world around him, but also the internal terrain he had neglected for so long. Malik's thoughts turned to his relationships. He considered family gatherings, conversations with friends, and professional collaborations. All had been conducted with diligence and care, yet all had been mediated by restraint. He realized that while he had been seen as strong and capable, he had rarely allowed others to witness his vulnerability. In prioritizing the expectations of others, he had created a private world in which emotions were managed internally. It's often unacknowledged and sometimes unrecognized even by himself. The awareness was both liberating and frightening. Malik recognized that the absence he felt was not a transient state, but a cumulative consequence of decades of emotional management. It had allowed him to survive, to function, to meet expectations. Yet it had also distanced him from the fullness of human experience. He understood with sudden clarity that enduring without acknowledgment does not equate to thriving. Strength, he realized, can conceal profound isolation. Malik paused on a street corner, sunlight falling directly on his face, illuminating his features in stark detail. He closed his eyes briefly and allowed himself to feel the weight of the revelation. The quiet accumulation of years, the subtle patterns of restraint, the habitual prioritization of others, all of it had left a mark that was invisible externally, but profoundly tangible internally. The wound he had carried silently for so long was no longer just a background presence. It demanded recognition. Even as he stood there, partially hidden in plain sight, he felt the complexity of his existence as never before. His mind cataloged the years of endurance, the moments of unacknowledged longing, the persistent quietude of his inner life. Each memory, each suppressed emotion, each act of composure now appeared as evidence of the gap between outward appearance and internal reality. The contrast was stark against the brightness of the day, which revealed with unflinching honesty the dissonance between the life he showed and the life he lived internally. Malik's recognition extended to his body as well. He noted the subtle tension in his shoulders, the faint tightness in his chest, the fatigue that sleep had never fully alleviated. These physical manifestations of internal strain were familiar, but he had often ignored them, attributing them to age, stress, or routine. On this bright day, however, they seemed inseparable from the emotional absence he had so long evaded acknowledging. The world continued moving around him, vibrant, unrestrained, alive. Market vendors shouted prices, children played with abandon, and neighbors exchanged greetings with warmth and spontaneity. Malik observed all of it, fully aware of the energy and color, yet simultaneously aware of his partial absence. He could not fully inhabit the world around him, could not engage without restraint, could not allow himself to experience the unfiltered range of emotion others seemed to embody naturally. The realization was not accompanied by despair, but by clarity. Malik understood that this recognition was the first step toward confronting the subtle wound that had been invisible for so long. Acknowledgement, he realized, was necessary before any healing could begin. Strength, endurance, and composure had carried him through decades of life. Now, recognition and acceptance were required for the next stage of existence. As Malik resumed walking, sunlight casting long shadows behind him, he reflected on the years of quiet absence, the habitual suppression, and the delicate balance that had maintained the appearance of normalcy. The brilliance of the day no longer merely illuminated the world. It illuminated the unseen contours of his own internal landscape. He recognized the need for deliberate engagement with his emotions, the necessity of presence, and the importance of allowing himself to inhabit life fully rather than partially. By the time he reached his usual destination, a small cafe where he occasionally paused for tea, Malik carried a heightened awareness of both the beauty of the world and the subtle gap between external functionality and internal experience. The bright day had revealed the depth of the pain he had carried silently, the quiet absence that had defined so much of his life, the potential for change that could only begin with recognition. Malik, standing at the threshold of awareness. The bright day has revealed what has been hidden. The weight of years of silence and suppression is now tangible. And the contrast between outward appearance and inner reality has been starkly illuminated. The wound he has carried unnoticed is now visible to him, demanding acknowledgement and understanding. Life continues around him, vibrant and unrelenting. While Malik begins the delicate process of confronting the absence he has experienced for decades, preparing for the transformation that is inevitable once recognition occurs. The evening settled over Lagos with a soft amber glow that softened the edges of the city's chaos. The traffic hummed in the distance. Voices and laughter from markets and homes mingled in the warm air, and the scent of freshly cooked food carried faintly through open windows. The city breathed around Malik, alive and untamed. Yet he walked with measured steps, immersed in his own private world of reflection. The bright clarity of the day had passed, but its revelations remained with him, pressing gently yet persistently on the awareness that had begun to surface hours earlier. Malik paused under the shade of a large tree at the corner of the street, the fading sunlight painting golden highlights on its rough bark. He looked up at the sky, at the faint streaks of orange and pink weaving across the horizon, felt something unfamiliar, the quiet insistence of his own presence. He had spent so many years moving through life without allowing himself to inhabit it fully, that it was almost shocking to feel it now. This was the first time in a long while that he recognized the gap, not merely intellectually, but viscerally, in the subtle tension in his chest, the quiet ache behind his eyes, the restless energy in his hands. For decades, Malik had been a model of composure. He had been reliable, admired, and trusted it deeply unseen. He had never cried in front of others. He had never allowed himself to be raw in the presence of family, friends, or colleagues. The weight of this habitual restraint had accumulated quietly, each act of suppression reinforcing the notion that vulnerability was dangerous, unnecessary, or shameful. The bright day had revealed this truth, and now, as the sun descended, a softer, more reflective moment allowed it to speak in whispers he could no longer ignore. He remembered the first moments of insight that afternoon, the clarity with which he had noticed his partial absence, the sudden awareness of years spent observing life rather than fully participating in it, the recognition that strength and endurance had masked profound isolation. Each memory he conjured the times he deferred his grief, the moments he concealed joy, the countless acts of measured restraint now felt heavy, tangible, and demanding attention. For the first time, he felt the weight not as a shield, but as a wound, seeking acknowledgement. Malik's reflection was interrupted by a small, seemingly ordinary interaction that carried extraordinary significance. A child ran past him, chasing a bright yellow balloon, laughing with abandon. The balloon caught in a nearby tree branch, and the child cried out, disappointment and frustration mingling in her voice. Malik instinctively stepped forward, helping retrieve the balloon while offering gentle reassurance. As the child's smile returned and she ran off, he noticed something in himself he hadn't recognized for years, a flicker of unfiltered emotion, unmediated by duty or composure. A spark of joy, genuine and spontaneous, surged briefly through him. It was fleeting, but it was enough to reveal a truth he could no longer ignore. Emotions he had long suppressed were not gone, they were alive, patient, and persistent. They had been waiting for acknowledgement, quietly observing, resilient in their invisibility. The sight of the child's recovered balloon had opened a small window into his own capacity for presence, a reminder that the internal world he had long neglected could still be inhabited. As Malik continued walking, he noticed the world around him with a heightened sensitivity. The rustle of leaves in the gentle evening breeze, the subtle pattern of light and shadow on the pavement, the laughter of neighbors sharing stories across fences all resonated in a way that demanded recognition. For the first time, he allowed himself to pause, to observe without immediately calculating, controlling, or redirecting his attention. The world was vibrant, and for a moment, Malik allowed himself to inhabit it fully. That night, when he returned to his modest apartment, he resisted his usual routines of immediate organization, quiet meals, and solitary reflection that avoided confrontation with himself. Instead, he sat by the window, the city lights twinkling like distant stars, and allowed the day's realizations to permeate his consciousness. He did not rush to rationalize them, nor did he attempt to moderate the intensity of his experience. He simply noticed the tension in his chest, the flicker of emotion in his mind, the subtle longing for connection that had gone unacknowledged for decades. Malik realized that the wound he had carried silently was not merely a metaphorical construct, it was embodied, physical, and persistent. Years of habitual suppression had left traces in his posture, his breathing, and the subtle rhythms of his body. The absence he had experienced was no longer simply an intellectual observation. It had manifested in the lived experience of his own flesh and mind. Recognizing it was painful, but necessary, for the first time, he felt the urgent need to attend to himself, to acknowledge what he had long neglected, and to take deliberate steps toward emotional presence. He thought of the countless interactions he had navigated without fully inhabiting them, conversations in which he had nodded without feeling, advice given without attachment, tasks executed without awareness of his own desires. Each instance, he realized, had reinforced the distance between outward functionality and inner experience. Yet now, with recognition, the potential for change became tangible. The wound remained, but acknowledgement was the first step toward healing. Malik's awareness deepened as he reflected on his relationships. He considered the family members who relied on him, friends who admired him, and colleagues who trusted him. In each case, he recognized the limitation imposed by his habitual absence. He had contributed to others' lives generously, yet had withheld from himself the same generosity. He had given stability, but denied vulnerability. He had provided guidance, but avoided seeking support. He had demonstrated strength, but neglected presence. The realization was sobering, but it also illuminated a path forward, acknowledgement, elaborate, and deliberate inhabitation of his own life. The night deepened, and Malik remained by the window, tracing patterns in the city lights, feeling the ebb and flow of his own attention. He allowed himself to identify emotions that had long been muted: grief for his father, longing for authentic connection, frustration at years of unrecognized suppression, and a quiet hope for transformation. For the first time, these emotions were not compartmentalized, deferred, or rationalized. They were present, acknowledged, and named. Malik recognized the paradox of strength. The very traits that had sustained him, composure, endurance, reliability, had also concealed his vulnerability and fostered absence. Strength had protected him, but it had also isolated him. The recognition was neither judgment nor regret. It was clarity. Strength alone was insufficient for living fully. Emotional presence, acknowledgement of self, and engagement with inner reality were necessary complements to resilience. As he reflected, Malik considered the possibilities for change. He envisioned small acts, allowing emotion in daily interactions, expressing vulnerability with trusted family members, seeking dialogue with friends, exploring personal desires long deferred, cultivating awareness of bodily and emotional signals. Each small act represented a deliberate step toward inhabiting life fully rather than partially. The realization was empowering yet daunting. For decades, Malik had relied on habitual restraint. Now, conscious engagement required courage, patience, and practice. The moment crystallized for Malik. The invisible wound had spoken. Not through dramatics or crises, but through the subtle accumulation of years of absence, through sudden recognition in the bright clarity of day, through glimpses of unmediated emotion, and through the quiet insistence of his own presence. The wound demanded acknowledgement. Not because it sought to harm him, but because healing required awareness, recognition, and deliberate action. Malik's reflection continued late into the night. He traced the contours of his inner landscape, noticing areas long suppressed: grief, longing, joy, frustration, love, and hope. Each emotion was a thread in a tapestry he had avoided weaving, threads that now demanded careful attention. The recognition of these threads was not merely intellectual. It was a visceral experience, felt in the chest, in the gut, in the subtle cadence of breath. The wound was alive, persistent, but no longer invisible to himself. By the end of the night, Malik experienced a quiet transformation. Not dramatic, not instantaneous, but profound in its subtlety. The recognition of absence, the acknowledgement of emotion, and the clarity regarding the limitations of habitual strength laid the groundwork for deliberate inhabitation of life. The wound remained, but its invisibility had ended. It had spoken, and Malik had listened. The invisible wound that had shaped decades of life, silent, unseen, and unacknowledged, had revealed itself. Recognition, acknowledgement, and subtle emotional presence became the foundation for the next phase of his existence. Life would continue around him, vibrant and unrelenting. But now, Malik could begin to inhabit it fully, engage with his inner reality, and transform absence into presence. The bright day, the quiet evening, and the accumulation of reflection had converged to speak the truth he could no longer ignore. The wound was real. It mattered, and it demanded response. The stage was set. Malik's journey from silent endurance to conscious inhabitation had begun. The invisible wound had spoken. The dawn came softly, with light that spilled over the rooftops of Lagos in gentle golds and pinks. Malik awoke unusually early, the morning quiet, almost deafening in contrast to the chaos of the city that would soon awaken around him. For the first time in decades, he did not rise with habitual precision. Nor did he immediately attend to tasks, obligations, or responsibilities. He lay still for a moment, feeling the weight of the night's realizations pressing subtly but insistently. He noticed the rhythm of his own breathing, the faint tension in his shoulders, the quiet murmur of thoughts that no longer demanded immediate suppression. Today, the day felt different. It carried the promise of conscious engagement with himself, the possibility of healing the invisible wound that had defined so much of his life. Malik rose and moved to the window, leaning against the frame, looking out across the city. The streets glimmered with the light of morning. Vendors set up their stalls, children ran to school. Motorbikes hummed along familiar routes, and neighbors greeted each other with familiar warmth. The world, vibrant and alive, seemed to call to him differently than it ever had. Where he had once observed life as a distant spectator, now there was a subtle pull of suggestion that presence could be chosen, that engagement could be deliberate, and that the inner life he had long neglected could be inhabited. He breathed slowly, consciously, aware of the spaces in his chest and mind that had been empty for too long. He began the day with a quiet intention to acknowledge himself fully, to inhabit the moments of his own life without mediation or suppression. Small acts became first steps. He washed his hands deliberately, noticing the sensation of warm water against skin, the smell of soap lingering in the air. He prepared tea with intention, observing the rising steam, the warmth of the cup, the subtle color of the liquid. These were ordinary acts, but now each carried significance. Malik realized that attention to the mundane was itself a form of healing, a way to inhabit life fully, moment by moment, without the constant filter of duty or restraint. He dressed carefully, choosing clothing not for appearances alone, but for comfort, texture, and the tactile experience of life. Each garment brushed against his skin as a reminder that the body, often neglected in the pursuit of outward reliability, was a repository of sensation and emotional resonance. Malik acknowledged the subtle tension in his muscles, fatigue of years of endurance, and the quiet resilience that had carried him through countless responsibilities. The body had been a silent witness to his suppression. Now it would be a partner in conscious inhabitation. The city called, and Malik answered with intentionality. He walked through streets familiar yet newly vivid, allowing himself to notice details that had previously passed unnoticed: the glint of sunlight on painted walls, the rhythmic movement of pedestrians, the faint scent of cooking drifting from open kitchens. He observed without judgment, without calculation, and without suppression. Emotions arose naturally, unfiltered by habit. He felt curiosity, appreciation, subtle joy, and even a quiet ache for moments that had been missed. The internal wound remained, but acknowledgement softened its weight. Presence, he realized, could coexist with pain. Malik visited his family first, entering the household with quiet awareness. His siblings were engaged in their routines, but Malik allowed himself to participate, not merely as the reliable figure they had long known, but as a present, engaged individual. Conversations flowed differently. He listened attentively, allowing pauses for reflection, and responded with authenticity rather than habitual composure. Small moments of laughter emerged naturally, and when emotions arose, grief, nostalgia, subtle longing, he allowed them space rather than suppressing them. Family noticed a difference, subtle but unmistakable. Malik was present in a way he had not been for decades. He spoke to his siblings about small personal reflections, sharing insights from his recent awareness of absence and emotional suppression. At first, the words were tentative, unfamiliar to him, but gradually they became easier. Vulnerability, he discovered, was not destructive. It was connective. His siblings responded with empathy, curiosity, and warmth, validating not only his presence, but also the emotions he had long buried. The process was not dramatic. It was subtle, grounded, and real. The recognition that sharing internal experience could be safe marked the beginning of emotional expansion. In the afternoons, Malik turned outward to the broader community. He visited local markets, not to perform duties or offer advice, but to observe, interact, and inhabit the energy of life consciously. Vendors, neighbors, and passers noticed a subtle shift. Malik engaged not as a functionary, but as a participant. He smiled spontaneously, laughed when something struck him as genuinely amusing, and allowed curiosity to guide interactions. These small acts of conscious engagement were transformative. Life had not changed. Malik's presence had. He spent time in spaces he had long neglected: quiet parks, shaded courtyards, and familiar streets that carried personal history. Here he allowed reflection to deepen. He remembered the years of habitual suppression, the accumulation of unseen emotion, the persistent absence that had defined so much of his adult existence. Memories of grief for his father, of deferred longing, of joy muted for decades, all surfaced in a gentle stream. Malik neither resisted nor rationalized. He simply observed and acknowledged. Recognition, he realized, was itself healing. Malik returned to the apartment in the late afternoon, carrying the awareness of the day's intentional presence. He paused to write, not for performance, obligation, or external validation, but to articulate internal experience. Words flowed slowly, deliberately, capturing the subtle textures of thought and emotion long neglected. He wrote about the wound, the absence, the long years of endurance, and the subtle moments of insight that had emerged during the bright day. Writing became a bridge, a tool for acknowledgement, and a medium for inhabiting his internal life fully. As evening approached, Malik prepared a simple meal, allowing himself to notice every texture, aroma, and flavor. Eating became a conscious practice, a ritual of presence. He noticed how the warmth of the food spread through him, how subtle flavors evoked memories, how nourishment itself was an act of self-acknowledgement. The body, once merely a vehicle for functionality, became a source of resonance and connection. Night fell, and Malik sat by the window again, observing the city lights. This time, however, he felt different, not absent, not partially engaged, but fully present in observation and reflection. The city, vibrant and unrelenting, seemed to mirror his own internal transformation. He allowed himself to feel gratitude, subtle joy, and hope for the first time without immediately suppressing it or redirecting it toward duty. He recognized that life's richness could be experienced alongside responsibility, and that acknowledgement of the inner wound did not negate strength that complemented it. In the days that followed, Malik's transformation deepened. He cultivated habits of presence, intentional pauses, reflective writing, mindful observation, an open dialogue with family and trusted friends. He explored spaces of vulnerability, allowing emotions to arise without judgment or suppression. Over time, he discovered that the world responded to his authentic presence not with alarm or discomfort, but with reciprocity, empathy, and connection. The relationships he had long relied upon for stability now became avenues for mutual growth and emotional depth. He revisited memories that had previously been sources of subtle pain, moments with his father, lost opportunities, deferred dreams, and relationships constrained by habitual restraint. This time, he allowed acknowledgement and reflection rather than suppression. Tears, long deferred, emerged naturally. Laughter muted for decades arose spontaneously. Both grief and joy coexisted, offering a complex but authentic emotional experience. Malik discovered that healing was not linear. It was layered, textured, and deeply human. Malik's awareness extended into his professional life as well. Tasks, decisions, and responsibilities continued, but they were now accompanied by conscious presence. He allowed emotion, reflection, and authenticity to guide engagement. Colleagues noticed subtle differences. Malik's interactions carried warmth, attentiveness, and resonance that had previously been constrained by habitual composure. His effectiveness remained, but it was now enhanced by emotional presence. Functionality and authenticity coexisted, reinforcing rather than undermining each other. In community spaces, Malik discovered the power of engagement beyond duty. He participated in conversations with neighbors, offering not only guidance but authentic insight. He listened without immediately solving, acknowledged without immediately intervening, and shared without calculating impact. His presence became a source of subtle inspiration, demonstrating that strength could coexist with vulnerability and that endurance need not obscure emotional depth. Malik also explored solitude differently. Moments alone were no longer for mere reflection or avoidance. They became spaces of active engagement with self. He meditated, observed bodily sensations, acknowledged emotions, and nurtured curiosity about his own responses to the world. The body, mind, and spirit became integrated through conscious practice. The wound, once invisible, was now recognized and attended to with deliberate care. Over weeks and months, Malik's inner transformation manifested externally. Relationships deepened. Joy became more consistent. Moments of sadness were acknowledged and processed rather than deferred. The habitual absence that had defined his existence gradually receded, replaced by presence, awareness, and emotional engagement. Strength was no longer equated with suppression. It was complemented by authenticity and self-acknowledgement. He revisited childhood spaces, streets, and memories with new eyes. The laughter of children, the patterns of market life, and the warmth of family interactions now resonated fully. Emotions, once muted for decades, were experienced with depth and clarity. Malik recognized that the invisible wound had been both a source of resilience and a barrier to authentic living. Healing required acknowledgement, presence, and engagement. By the end of the year, Malik had transformed the subtle architecture of his inner life. The wound remained, as all wounds do, but it no longer dictated the terms of his existence. It had spoken, and he had listened. recognition, presence, an intentional inhabitation of life had shifted his existence from partial absence to authentic engagement. Strength remained, but it was now informed by vulnerability, reflection, and conscious choice. Malik understood at last that living fully did not mean erasing pain or avoiding responsibility. It meant embracing presence, acknowledging emotion, and participating in life authentically. The invisible wound had guided him to this insight. It had demanded recognition, shaped reflection, and ultimately led to healing that was both gradual and profound. The city of Lagos continued its relentless rhythm, vibrant, chaotic, and alive. Malik moved through it differently now, fully present, emotionally attuned, and consciously inhabiting each moment. The wound no longer remained unseen. It had been acknowledged, honored, and integrated into a life enriched by awareness, depth, and authenticity. Strength and vulnerability coexisted, presence replaced absence, and the invisible wound had finally spoken its truth. The story ends, not with perfection or completion, but with transformation, presence, and the beginning of sustained emotional engagement, a life that acknowledges both pain and joy, endurance and vulnerability, absence and presence. Malik's journey demonstrates that even the deepest, longest hidden wounds can be recognized, attended to, and transformed, opening the way to authentic, fully inhabited life.